Former South Carolina governor and congressman Mark Sanford just announced that he is going to make it official. He is going to take on President Trump. Just a few hours ago, the president doing what the president does. He tweeted about it. He called out the biggest scandal of Sanford's career in public service when he went MIA as governor to visit a woman with whom he was having an affair in Argentina. The president then lumped Sanford in with the two other Republicans running against him and called them the Three Stooges. Mark Sanford joins me now. Governor, Congressman, thank you for your time. How are you?
I'm good. Pleasure to be with you.
Which stooge would you be?
I don't know.
So if you mount this serious race against the president, you can expect tweets like these.
Certainly.
This is what he does. What's going to be your response?
My response is that we need a change from the way that he is pejorative on everybody. I mean, what's weird about it, I mean, think about this for a moment. As a Republican, I voted with him 90% of the time, 90% of the time. And in normal political circles and in normal business world and in normal family world, I love my brothers and my sister, but I'm not with them 90% of the time, nor are they with me 90% of the time. But part and parcel to human relations is accepting there can be differences. But right now, the sun, moon, and stars too often basically orbit around Donald Trump. And if it's not personal allegiance to him, not issue allegiance or idea allegiance, but if it's not personal allegiance, it's not good enough. And so what I would hope to do is to break from what he's doing, which is to criticize everybody and everything that is not within his circle, and to go back to old-style politics where we can agree to disagree on occasion, but as Republicans, as Democrats, as independents, have a real conversation.
But if you're having that kind of conversation, if you're running that kind of campaign, this so-called old-school campaign, and he's doing what he does, which has been politically quite successful for him, how do you counter that?
I would challenge that assumption, though,
okay,
because what you saw in the midterm congressional elections was Trump fatigue. I saw it in the congressional district that I represented, wherein that district had been a Republican district for about 50 years. For the first time in 50 years, it went Democrat because suburban women said no more, young millennials said no more, and I think that there's been erosion to people's, tolerance for the way in which he's intolerant to seemingly most anybody out there. I mean, think about this. Paul Ryan, a loser, though he orchestrated the very tax plan that the president takes credit of. Somebody like Rex Tillerson, you can like him or dislike him, but distinguished business career. I mean, somebody like General Mattis or General Kelly. I mean, people with distinguished careers are suddenly losers if they're outside the Trump orbit.
How does that happen? What happened?
It's the personal allegiance thing we're talking about.
We could play this game all day. I mean, there have been a number of others who have decided to work for this president, and all of a sudden they find themselves on the outs.
What
happened to Lindsey Graham? What happened to
That's
South
a whole
Carolina's
different
senior
conversation.
senator? But what do we think happened to him?
I think what happened is he saw what happened to me. He figures, I don't want a primary challenge. If the cost of admission, in quote, staying relevant, as he's put it, I won't, getting in that orbit of Trump, we'll just leave it at that, then that's what I'll do, and that's what he's done.
Is the price of admission selling your soul?
I didn't say that. That's where I was sort of catching my words there.
But that's what you wanted to say.
No, I wasn't saying that.
Let's talk about these states where it looks like there may not even be a primary or a caucus. 4 states have either canceled or are considering canceling their primaries or caucuses. And I think we have a map to show it. Arizona, Kansas, Nevada, our state of South Carolina as well. How do you run in an election without an election day?
Well, fortunately, I mean, South Carolina, as important as it is to you and me, it at the end of the day is not the national election. It's a state within what will hopefully be a national election. And so I would say there are 2 things that stand out for me. One, think about how unusual this is politically. If you can stack up a 90% win, which he alleges I've got 90% support, if you can, in the world of politics, stack up a 90% win in the first of the South primary, given its implications in other primaries in the South, you'd do it. What it says to me is that their own team has looked at the numbers and sees their support as a mile wide and an inch deep, and you would not cancel that South Carolina primary were there not for personal worries on that front, particularly if you got a 2-term governor and somebody who's who's been in the House of Representatives 12 years, who has some degree of political organization and the ability to build a political organization in that state in a presidential campaign. I think that that's interesting. The other thing that to me is interesting is, are we taking our cues from North Korea? I mean, the idea of a conservative Republican saying we're going to stand up against big media because we don't want to be told what to do, but we're going to be okay with the idea of a couple folks in the smoke-filled room deciding that the common folk of South Carolina can't participate in making their voices heard in the democratic process. This is getting weird, and I think we ought to call it as such.
Are you planning any legal challenges in these states?
I don't know. We're going to look at all options, but again, you can spend a lot of time trying to go after, less than 5 million people that make up South Carolina. You can go after the more than 300 million people that do make up our country, and that's probably where I'll focus.
You know, obviously, that this is a long shot bid. Sure. The odds are stacked against you. How much of this is about Mark Sanford really wanting to be president of the United States, and how much of this is about Mark Sanford not wanting Donald Trump to be president of the United States for another 4 years?
Or maybe it's a third option, which is what it is for me, which is I believe in certain ideas. And you and I have known each other for a long time. We've overlapped in you and your world and me and mine. And what I think anybody out there, whether they're friend or foe, would say, I've consistently fought on behalf of the taxpayer, whether your pocketbook or your wallet. And this issue of debt and deficits and government spending is not a new issue. It's something I've long believed in. And the people that came to me encouraging this run, their point was, Mark, you've got 25 years of your life invested. What is some chapter, whether that's months or whether that's a year plus, going forward, given how much time you've already invested in this subject? And it's not just that. It's the very themes that I talked about in my concession speech almost a year and a half ago in terms of where are we going in terms of political norms, where are we going in terms of humility and tone in the party, where are we going on trade. A whole host of issues need to be talked about. And whether that ends up being just a conversation or end up president of the United States, I don't know. The voters decide that one.
So the Sanford voter, it sounds like the Sanford voter is a suburban woman, someone who's concerned about the spiraling debts and deficits in this country, someone who is aligned with you with regards to trade. Who else is the Sanford voter?
Well, no, this is the big question of my campaign. And if I'm right on my hunch, the campaign will be long-lived. If I'm wrong, it won't be. And that is the thousands, and I had thousands of different conversations over my 25 years in politics with the small business person struggling to make it, with the folks at home who were talking about how tough it was to get their family checkbook balanced, that those people have not gone away. Those people were core to the Republican Party and what it used to stand for. They haven't been talked to here lately, and the president said those concerns you have with regard to spending, they're out the window, we're not going to worry about them, the economy is great. But I believe that they're still there. And I'd like to have a conversation with them because that spans well beyond the suburban woman that you're talking about. It spans to a whole range of different socioeconomic groupings and a whole range of different demographics.
Do you dispute the characterization about our economy, that it is the characterization that comes out of the White House, at least, that the economy is strong?
Absolutely, I contest that. Because you can buy growth. Show me the number you want to get to, and I'll tell you the price to get there. But think about what the Fed has been doing. If you look at the average recession over the last 50 years, you've seen a 5 and a 5. 5 points in terms of lowering of interest rates by the Fed in terms of dealing with that recession, and about a 5-point increase in terms of the size of the deficit. Guess what? We got no room on either side right now. The Fed doesn't have room to move, and from a fiscal policy standpoint, in terms of government, it doesn't have room to. We are more vulnerable than I think we've been at any point in the history of our country, economically, save for the start of our country, the Civil War and World War II.
You're going to try and run a campaign on debts, deficits, and spending. You and I both know that's not sexy. And
that's not it. I mean, we just talked about a couple of different things. But that's the central, that's the bullseye for me. And then, again, trade, again, tone, again, political and political culture and institute. I mean, there are a lot of different things.
You're prepared for the president to go personal for however long you're in the race, to continue to attack you on Twitter, to go. You're prepared for that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing about my journey is I've been to some tough spots.
Yeah.
And so the idea of him, quote, mortally wounding me with a Twitter, I don't think it's going to happen.
You've only lost one race, if my memory serves me correctly. It was your last congressional race. What did you learn from that loss that's going to make you a better candidate right now?
I learned, I guess, a couple of different things. I learned, one, how real the Trump phenomenon is. It is a powerful force right now in the Republican Party. But I also learned that it's not immutable. I mean, in other words, it needs to be challenged. I mean, that night of four sons and I stayed up till 3 o'clock in the morning that night talking about life. And what they said to a boy was, Dad, you did the right thing. You've taught us about certain principles, certain lessons, and the importance of standing on them. You did, and we're proud of you. What I learned in that election is how there are things well beyond politics that go to the heart of who we are as human beings that are occasionally worth standing for, and I believe that that's the case with this election right now. There's some principles out there that I think we all need to stand for as Americans that I think have gone awry with this White House.
Mark Sanford. All right. Where's the first stop as a candidate? Where are you going?
I'm headed back to South Carolina.
Of course you are. Safe travels, my friend.
Sir.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Good luck out there.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.